What if I told you that a single decision, made by a young man barely in his 20s, shattered the greatest empire the world had ever seen? Imagine it, the Persian Empire, stretching from the Aegean to the edges of India. Armies counted in the hundreds of thousands, treasures that glittered like the sun, and kings who believed themselves untouchable. Against them stood Alexander, not yet seasoned, not yet 30, but carrying the fire of ambition and the weight of his father's legacy. He didn't just march into history, he stormed it. He dared to believe he could outwit a power that had crushed revolts and humbled kings. But how? What could possibly give a young Macedonian ruler the audacity to challenge Persia, a realm that had stood for centuries? The answer lies in one brilliant strategy, a maneuver so unexpected, so devastating, that it changed the balance of the ancient world forever. This was not a story of luck. This was the story of a mind that could see through chaos, a leader who could bend fear into courage, and a strategist who could transform weakness into victory. Tonight, we step into that world, into the dust of the battlefield, the clash of iron, the fear in the hearts of men, and the single daring plan that brought the Persian Empire crashing down. But first, who was Alexander, before the world began to whisper his name as great? Number 1. The boy who dreamed of empire. What shapes a conqueror? Was Alexander born with destiny carved into his blood? Or did the world mold him into the man who would topple Persia? Long before he marched with armies, Alexander was just a boy in the palace of Pella, the Macedonian capital. His father, King Philip II, was a man of iron will and ruthless ambition, a ruler who transformed Macedonia from a fragile kingdom into a rising military power. But for young Alexander, it was not just Philip's victories that mattered. It was the lessons whispered into his ear by another figure, a man whose words carried as much weight as spears and swords, Aristotle. Yes, that Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of his age, the man who taught Alexander not just about science, ethics, and politics, but about myth, glory, and the nature of power itself. Aristotle planted a seed deep within the boy's heart, the idea that the world was vast, rich, and waiting to be claimed. He taught Alexander about Homer's Iliad, about Achilles, the warrior whose name would live forever. And Alexander? He didn't just study Achilles. He began to believe he could become Achilles. But dreams alone don't make conquerors. The boy had to be tested. That test came when his father Philip united Greece under Macedonian control. Yet even then, shadows of doubt lingered. What would become of this young prince? Would he fade into obscurity, overshadowed by his father's towering legacy? Then fate struck. Philip was assassinated. In the sudden silence of death, chaos threatened to unravel Macedonia. Alexander, only 20 years old, was thrust into power. Enemies circled, allies doubted him, and whispers spread. This boy is too young. He will never hold the throne. But Alexander's answer was swift and merciless. He crushed rebellions in Greece with a speed that stunned even his rivals. In Thebes, when the city dared to rise against him, he unleashed destruction so absolute that it served as a warning to all of Greece. This boy was no boy at all. He was a lion in human form. And yet, even as the smoke of Thebes darkened the skies, Alexander's gaze was not fixed on Greece. His ambition looked eastward, across the sea, where the Persian Empire loomed like a giant. The boy who dreamed of empire was ready to step onto the world stage. But how could he? How could a 20-year-old king with a modest army dare to challenge Persia, the largest empire humanity had ever seen? The answer begins with his father's legacy and a single daring decision. Number 2. The challenge of the impossible. Why did Alexander risk everything against Persia? Why not settle as king of Greece, safe and secure on his throne? Because for Alexander, safety was death. He craved glory, immortality, a place in history that no crown alone could give him. And Persia, the empire of Darius III, was the ultimate test. At first glance, the challenge was laughable. Persia commanded armies that dwarfed Alexander's force of 40,000. They had resources beyond imagination, war chariots armed with blades, cavalry that thundered across plains, and a network of satraps, governors who could summon tens of thousands at will. To confront Persia was to confront a hurricane with a candle. And yet, Alexander saw something no one else did. The Persian Empire was vast, but it was fragile. It stretched across deserts, mountains, and seas. Its armies were immense, but they were scattered, drawn from dozens of subject peoples with loyalties that wavered. Persia's power looked eternal, but Alexander sensed its weakness, disunity. He understood something his father had hinted at. If he could strike fast, before Persia gathered its full strength, he could break through the facade of invincibility. And so he made his move. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. As he stepped onto Persian soil, he cast a spear into the ground. His men watched in silence as he declared, "I accept this land as a gift to the gods." It was more than a gesture, it was a claim. A bold, reckless declaration that Persia no longer belonged to Darius, but to him. The first clash came at the Battle of the Granicus. Persian satraps gathered their forces to stop him at the riverbanks. They believed Alexander would hesitate to cross into swift currents under fire. But hesitation was not in Alexander's nature. He hurled himself into the river, leading his cavalry against the Persian line. Blades clashed, arrows filled the sky, chaos erupted in the waters. Yet Alexander's audacity prevailed. The Persians broke, leaving the field littered with their dead. The world took notice. The boy king had struck his first blow against the empire that once humbled Greece. But Persia would not fall from a single river crossing. Ahead lay the true test, the confrontation with Darius himself. And when that moment came, Alexander would unveil the strategy that would shock the ancient world. Number 3. The shadow of Darius. What happens when a king who believes himself untouchable suddenly meets his match? For Darius III, ruler of Persia, the news of Alexander's victories was both an insult and a threat. He could no longer dismiss this Macedonian youth as a nuisance. He had to confront him, or risk looking weak before his own empire. But here lay the Persian king's greatest flaw. He underestimated Alexander. Darius believed numbers would win the war. He gathered an army, so vast it stretched across the plains like an ocean of men. Some ancient accounts speak of 250,000 soldiers, though modern historians suspect the number was smaller. Yet still, it was a force that dwarfed Alexander's. The two armies met at Issus in 333 BCE. The setting could not have been more dramatic, a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by mountains and sea. Darius, with his massive army, had expected to crush Alexander on open ground. Instead, he found himself trapped in a bottleneck, where his numbers worked against him. Alexander seized the moment. He led a furious charge at the Persian center, his cavalry cutting deep into enemy lines. Darius, stunned by the ferocity of the attack, panicked. In a moment that would echo through history, the Persian king abandoned the battlefield. He left behind not just his army, but his own family, his wife, mother, and children, who fell into Alexander's hands. Imagine the humiliation. The king of kings, fleeing before a young invader. For Persia, it was unthinkable. For Alexander, it was the beginning of legend. He treated Darius's captured family with respect, even honor, winning admiration across the empire. But beneath that courtesy lay a cold message. Alexander was no barbarian raider. He was a rightful king. Darius, humiliated yet unbroken, swore revenge. He would gather an even greater army, one that would dwarf even Issus. He believed sheer numbers would finally crush the Macedonian upstart. But Alexander was already planning something Darius could never imagine. Number 4. The road through fire and blood. How do you defeat an empire built on centuries of power? Do you rush for the capital, or do you strip away its strength piece by piece? Alexander chose the latter. After Issus, the road to Persia's heart lay open, but he did not march directly toward Darius. Instead, he turned south, toward the coastal cities and strongholds that supplied Persia's naval power. He knew that as long as the Persian fleet controlled the seas, his supply lines would always be threatened. So Alexander embarked on a brutal but brilliant campaign of coastal conquest. City after city fell to him. Some surrendered willingly, fearing his wrath. Others resisted and paid the ultimate price. The most famous of these was Tyre. The island city stood proud, surrounded by walls that rose straight out of the sea. Many thought it impregnable, but Alexander refused to be denied. He ordered his men to build a causeway, an enormous bridge of stone and timber, stretching from the mainland to the island. Day by day, under showers of arrows and fire, the Macedonians built their path. The defenders mocked them at first. They believed no army could breach their walls. But slowly, the causeway grew. The sea itself seemed to bow before Alexander's will. When the bridge finally reached the city walls, Alexander unleashed his siege engines, smashing through defenses that had stood for centuries. Tyre fell in flames, its people slaughtered or enslaved. The world trembled at the message. Resistance meant annihilation. By the time Alexander marched into Egypt, he was no longer seen as a mere invader. Many Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. At the temple of Ammonius at Siwa, he was hailed as the son of a god. To his men, it was a powerful sign. Their king was destined for greatness beyond mortal measure. But destiny is not achieved without enemies. Even as Alexander basked in Egypt's adoration, Darius was preparing for their next clash. This time, the Persian king would gather such a vast host that no strategy, no brilliance, could save the Macedonian invader. Or so he believed. What neither Darius nor his countless soldiers knew was that Alexander carried with him a plan so daring, so unorthodox, that it would shatter Persia's might in a single stroke. Number 5. The storm at Gaugamela. What happens when a storm collides with an empire? It was October 331 BC. On the plains of Gaugamela, near modern-day Iraq, the fate of the ancient world would be decided. Darius stood at the head of perhaps the largest army ever assembled in antiquity. Chariots bristling with blades, war elephants, cavalry stretching to the horizon. This was not just an army. It was a spectacle of overwhelming power. Alexander's men were outnumbered 5-1. Any ordinary commander would have chosen retreat. But Alexander was no ordinary commander. On the eve of battle, his officers urged him to attack at night, when chaos could mask their disadvantage. Alexander refused. He wanted the world to see what he was about to do. He wanted history to witness his triumph in the full light of day. As dawn broke, Alexander's army moved into formation. He had studied the battlefield with an intensity that Darius could not match. The Persians expected a straightforward clash. Instead, Alexander did the unexpected. He stretched his right flank forward, drawing the Persians outward, luring them into disorder. When the moment came, he struck like lightning. Leading his companion cavalry, Alexander pierced through the gap in the Persian lines, driving straight for Darius. The charge was ferocious, precise, unstoppable. Dust rose, screams filled the air, and once again Darius, the so-called King of Kings, turned and fled. His massive army, left leaderless, collapsed into chaos. The Battle of Gaugamela was not just a victory. It was the destruction of an empire. In a single day, Alexander seized the crown of Persia. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the glittering capitals of the ancient world, would soon fall into his hands. But Alexander's triumph was not yet complete. The Persian king still lived, still fled, still believed he could rebuild. To secure his conquest, Alexander would have to chase Darius to the ends of the earth. And in that chase, fate would deliver a twist neither man could foresee. Number 6. The fall of the King of Kings. What becomes of a king who loses everything? For Darius III, the world had crumbled. Twice he had faced Alexander, twice he had fled, and twice he had left behind not only his soldiers, but his honor. Yet still, he dreamed of raising another army, of turning back the tide that swept over his empire. But his satraps, the governors and nobles who once swore loyalty, saw the truth. Persia was broken. Alexander had become too powerful, too inevitable. And loyalty to a fallen king was a dangerous burden. As Darius fled eastward, pursued relentlessly by Alexander, betrayal closed in. One of his own satraps, Bessus of Bactria, turned against him. In a desperate bid to seize power, Bessus captured Darius, hoping to present himself as the new king of Persia. But Alexander was closing in fast. Knowing he could not outrun the Macedonian conqueror, Bessus made his choice. He had Darius killed, left bleeding in a wagon, abandoned on the road. When Alexander finally reached him, the once mighty king of kings was already dead. Imagine the moment. Alexander, standing over the lifeless body of his greatest rival. Did he feel triumph? Relief? Or was there, deep within him, a flicker of disappointment? That fate had denied him the satisfaction of defeating Darius face to face? What we know is this: Alexander honored Darius with a royal burial. It was more than respect, it was a declaration. The Persian king was gone, and Alexander stood as his rightful successor. The empire was his. But conquest did not end here. Persia had fallen, yes, but Alexander's ambition burned hotter than ever. His eyes now turned further east, toward lands his men had never seen, toward challenges that would test even his unbreakable will. For the boy who dreamed of empire, Persia was only the beginning. Number 7. The burning of Persepolis. Why would a conqueror destroy the jewel he had just won? When Alexander marched into Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, he stood at the very peak of triumph. Gold and silver filled the treasury. Palaces glittered with carvings and jewels. For centuries, Persepolis had been the pride of Persia, a city that embodied the grandeur of kings. And now it lay in Alexander's hands. At first, he walked through its halls with awe, but awe soon turned to fire. One night, after a lavish feast, flames engulfed the palaces. Some say it was an accident of drunken revelry. Others believe it was deliberate, Alexander's way of avenging Greece for the Persian burning of Athens long before his time. Whatever the reason, Persepolis burned so fiercely that its ruins can still be seen today. As the flames lit the sky, many of Alexander's men cheered. To them, it was justice, the final humiliation of their ancient enemy. But others whispered uneasily. Had Alexander gone too far? Was this a conqueror's triumph or a god's arrogance? The burning of Persepolis marked more than the fall of a city. It marked a turning point in Alexander himself. He was no longer simply the avenger of Greece. He was beginning to see himself as something greater, as the ruler of East and West combined, a king whose power was not bound by borders or cultures. Yet ambition is a flame as dangerous as any fire. And soon, Alexander's desire to push beyond Persia would drive him into battles even his men feared to fight. For while Persia had fallen, another land awaited, India. And there, Alexander would face not only mighty kings, but the limits of his own destiny. Number 8. The edge of the world. What happens when a conqueror pushes too far? With Persia under his control, Alexander might have stopped. He might have ruled as the greatest king the world had ever seen. But stopping was not in his nature. He wanted to see the end of the world, to march further east until no horizon remained. His march brought him into India, where rivers swelled like seas and jungles teemed with creatures his men had never imagined. It was here at the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE that Alexander faced King Porus, an Indian ruler commanding not just warriors, but war elephants. The battle was unlike anything Alexander's men had ever seen. The elephants charged, tusks glinting, trumpeting with a sound that shook the ground. Macedonian horses reared in terror. Soldiers faltered under the crushing weight of beasts trained for war. For a moment, even Alexander's brilliance seemed powerless against the raw force of nature itself. But once again he adapted. He split his forces, lured Porus into difficult ground, and struck with his cavalry at the flanks. The elephants, hemmed in and wounded, turned on their own men in panic. Porus fought valiantly, refusing to surrender until he was wounded and captured. When Alexander finally stood before the defeated king, he asked, "How would you like to be treated?" Porus, proud even in defeat, answered, "As a king." And Alexander, moved by his courage, granted him not just mercy but honor, restoring him as ruler under Macedonian authority. For the first time, Alexander was not merely a conqueror. He was becoming a builder of empire, blending east and west under his rule. But his men were weary. The jungles, the endless rains, the strange beasts, they broke the spirit of even the most loyal. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, when Alexander demanded they march further into the unknown, his soldiers refused. The boy who had once bent Greece and Persia to his will could not bend the hearts of men any longer. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back. But though he turned, fate was already marching toward him. Number 9. The price of greatness. What does it cost a man to conquer the world? By the time Alexander returned to Babylon, he was not the same young king who had once crossed the Hellespont with dreams of glory. He was worn, scarred, and restless. His empire stretched further than he had ever imagined, but ruling such vast lands was far more difficult than conquering them. Everywhere, whispers stirred. His men grumbled that he was becoming more Persian than Greek. He adopted Persian dress, Persian customs, and demanded to be treated not just as king, but as divine. The very soldiers who once followed him through deserts and storms now wondered if he had lost himself to ambition. Yet Alexander pressed on. He planned new campaigns, new conquests, even greater than before. Arabia was next on his list. Perhaps beyond Arabia. Who knew? To Alexander, the world still had no end. But the gods, it seemed, had other plans. In 323 BCE, at only 32 years old, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. Some say it was fever, others poison, others the exhaustion of years of ceaseless conquest. For days he lay in torment, unable to speak, surrounded by generals who waited for his final word. When asked to whom he left his empire, he whispered, "To the strongest." And with that, the conqueror of Persia, the man who had dreamed of uniting the world under one crown, was gone. But even in death, Alexander left behind something far greater than any treasure. He left behind a story, a legend, a strategy that showed the world how one man, with vision and daring, could bring down an empire thought eternal. And yet, the question lingers. Did Alexander conquer Persia? Or did Persia, in the end, consume him? Number 10. The strategy that shattered an empire. What was Alexander's true secret? Was it his armies, his wealth, his luck, or something far more dangerous? Historians have long debated how a young Macedonian king could defeat an empire as vast as Persia. But when we look closely, one answer rises above all others: strategy. Not just battlefield maneuvers, but a vision that fused speed, audacity, and psychology into a weapon sharper than any sword. At Granicus, Alexander proved that shock and daring could overwhelm larger numbers. At Issus, he showed that precision and terrain could unravel even the mightiest armies. At Gaugamela, he revealed the brilliance of feigned retreat and decisive strikes, tearing through a force 5 times his size. Again and again, he saw what his enemies could not, the cracks in their power. But perhaps his greatest strategy was not on the battlefield at all. It was in the way he presented himself, not as a destroyer, but as a rightful king. He spared captured nobles, honored defeated rulers, and adopted Persian customs. Where others saw division, Alexander created unity. He made his men believe they were not just fighting wars. They were building something eternal. That was the true brilliance. Alexander didn't merely fight Persia. He absorbed it. He broke its armies, yes, but he also claimed its legacy. He took the title of King of Kings, stood in the halls of Persepolis, and declared himself heir not just to Greece, but to Persia itself. This was his single brilliant strategy: to strike fast and strike hard, but also to transform enemies into subjects, to turn conquest into legitimacy. He didn't just win battles. He rewrote what it meant to rule an empire. Yet victory carries a shadow, for though Alexander conquered Persia, he never found peace within himself. The empire was his, but the world still seemed endless, and his hunger never ceased. Conclusion. And so, the story closes. A young king, no older than many students today, set out with an army dwarfed by the power of Persia. Through audacity, vision, and a single brilliant strategy, he achieved the impossible. He shattered an empire thought eternal. But what do we remember most? Not just the battles or the burning of Persepolis, not even the flight of Darius. We remember a man who fused daring with genius, who saw not only how to defeat his enemies, but how to inherit their power. That is why Alexander was called great. Yet history is not kind in the end. He died young, his empire torn apart by his own generals. The dream of one world under one crown crumbled as quickly as it rose. And still, his shadow lingers. Every conqueror who came after, from Caesar to Napoleon, studied him. Every strategist who dreamed of changing the world asked themselves the same question: how did he do it? And maybe that is the final legacy of Alexander, that across 2,000 years, his story still burns in our imagination. The boy who became a king, the king who became a conqueror, the conqueror who dared to take on Persia, and won.